In today's video, we're going to be taking a look at Canon's 80D and specifically the autofocus system on the camera. It's equipped with a 45-point AF system which gives good coverage, and aside from that fairly widespread grid, the camera also has quite a deeply adjustable set of parameters and controls. So those are the things we're going to be covering in today's video. The autofocus system and the way I set it up is pretty much for moving subjects, and it also is assuming that you're going to be using servo as your preferred mode of focusing, which is how I use my 80D for wildlife. On this camera, the autofocus settings are grouped not exactly in the same way as on some of its bigger brothers like the 7D2, 5D4 and the 1DX series, but it's still laid out in a pretty logical way. The way to find the autofocus settings is first to go to the menu, and then you can use the Q button to jump across, and once we get to the orange tab, you can see there that custom functions are what they're called. If we go to custom function 2, that is titled autofocus. I can press set and it opens up I'm just going to skip this using the big wheel. I'm going to start on option number 1. All in all, there are 16 autofocus adjustments available in this menu. But beginning with number 1, which is one of the single most important ones to master and to have an understanding of, it's called tracking sensitivity. You can see that we presented with a slider that has 4 positions on it. If I go into that slider and I use the wheel at the back, I can set it to -2 and the description is locked on, or I can set it to +2 on the opposite side and the description is responsive. The default setting on the camera is in the middle, which is 0. What tracking sensitivity really refers to is how sticky your autofocus point is with relation to a moving subject. So it's a parameter that has an impact on servo shooting, which is moving subject photography. And what it affects is how long our focus point will stay on a particular subject. So what you can imagine or what you can picture is using your 80D to track a moving bird or a moving animal across the frame, and you're doing your best to keep your active focus point right on that subject. At some point, and this happens to me quite often, I might accidentally move the lens a little slower, or my subject might move up or down and get away from my focus point. So now my focus point is no longer placed on that moving subject. What this parameter does is it determines how long the camera reacts in focusing on whatever's behind the focus point now, or how long it waits before it tries to refocus. So we're going to go back into that slider with that understanding and now have another look there. So if I've got it on locked on, I accidentally move my focus point away from the subject. If I'm photographing a bird in the sky, I may have blue sky behind me. The camera will actually wait perhaps up to a second before it tries to refocus. So the aim of that is to give me time to get that focus point back onto position before it grabs the background and I lose focus and lose the whole subject. Another place where the locked on setting can really help is if we're tracking something moving along and a new subject that's unintended moves between us and that subject. So we're following something moving and we get a bush in the foreground as we're tracking, or another animal runs across or moves across in front of us. the camera will wait up to a second if we have it on locked on, which can allow us to pass right through the obstruction and then pick up the subject moving on the other side. That is if we take locked on. According to Canon's literature, the fully locked on setting has little impact on how quickly the camera picks up initial autofocus. For myself, I tend to agree with what they've written, but I do also feel that having it all the way over to -2 so that the locked on setting is at its most powerful can slow down my autofocus response a little bit, especially if I have subjects that might be coming straight towards the camera. But that's just sort of a sort of perception. Most of the time I'm going to be working in the 0 to -1 range. If I choose to have my sensitivity set all the way to the far right to responsive +2, what that means is we're back in that scenario where we're tracking a moving subject, trying to keep the focus point on it, and for that split second we lose the subject. If you've got it on responsive, the 80D will immediately grab the background. So that can make the autofocus quite twitchy. If you find that happening to you, then it's probably a good idea to go in there and have it on 0 or one of the negative settings. I don't necessarily have a preference on tracking sensitivity that I use every time with every subject, with every background, and with every lens that I use. But the way that I normally start out working is on 0, and if I find that I'm grabbing the background too quickly and I'm dropping the subject, I'll go to -1 and then I'll see how it goes from there. That's typically how I go about using tracking sensitivity. Option number 2 on the autofocus menu is called accelerate or decelerate tracking. So this is another slider which really allows us to set up our camera to be more responsive to subjects that change their speed or change their direction of travel unexpectedly, or to set the autofocus to be optimized for subjects that move with a fairly stable and steady and predictable motion. So as it comes with 0 as the default, that's the most stable way we can set it up. If we would like the autofocus to be more responsive to these sudden, unpredictable kinds of movements, perhaps the type of things you might expect from birds that are flying in a strong wind, or something that's, the most unpredictable kind of subjects that you photograph, then you can work with +1 or even +2. Those are the 3 options, 0 being the default and 0 being the most stable. From my own shooting experience, I've found that this parameter is quite difficult to interpret in terms of how effective or ineffective it is. So I'm sure it does have an impact, but it's not something with the kind of shooting that I've been doing that has been really important for me, or one that's made a big difference, whatever I set it on. So I tend to leave mine on 0. Number 3 in the autofocus menu is AF point auto switching. So what does this mean? If we are using our camera in one of the modes where we are using more than a single focus point, so there I've got a group of 9 focus points. What the parameter that I stepped away from really refers to is how quickly those points communicate with one another. So if you just imagine that cluster of focus points again, there were 9, we were using the one called AF zone, or if we're using all 45 points or the large zone, anytime we're using a group of focus points, this parameter really controls how quickly one of those focus points will hand over focus to the one that's adjacent to it, or to the points that are adjacent to it. So if we're using a group of points, we may have selected a point to begin with, or we may have one focus point that's got a lock as we started with tracking. Now as we're following our subject along, the original point is losing its contrast or losing focus, it will hand over to the one next door to it. So this parameter allows us to set how rapidly that handover takes place. So if we leave it on 0, the handover takes place with a sort of a longer period. If we go to 1, the period for the handover to happen, or before the handover happens, is shortened. And if we on +2, then it's a very rapid handover to the adjacent points. I leave my ATD on 0, and again, this is a parameter that I found difficult to actually see the difference taking place while I'm shooting. So for now, I've had pretty good results with mine on 0. At this point, we're going to jump away from the menu for just for a moment, and we're going to actually take a look at the 45-point autofocus grid, because it relates directly to some of those parameters that we've been dealing with. So to get a visual idea of the autofocus grid, I'm just going to cycle through 4 different groupings which are available to us. So the 45-point grid goes quite far towards the edges of the frame, and it allows us to switch quite easily between a single point or one of a variety of different point groupings. So on the ATD, with its 45-point grid, the default focusing group choice is a single point. So that's one focus point which you can move around the frame by using the little pad on the back of the camera here, which is fairly awkward to move quickly, or I certainly find it that way. You also have to move one row at a time. So with 45 points, that means that there's quite a lot of vertical rows and horizontal rows to navigate. So even if you're right out on the far edge, there's no shortcut back to the middle. You've got to move one row at a time. Another way to move around the focus grid is to set up your front dial to give you horizontal movement, and then the back dial to give you vertical movement. But again, fairly time-consuming way of moving the focus point around the grid. But the single point focus is the most accurate and the fastest that I've found so far. If we go on to the next focus grouping, which we can get to by pushing the little button next to the shutter, it's called Zone AF. And here we've got a cluster of 9 focus points. We have no control over which of those 9 the camera starts to focus with. So when we point our camera at a subject and the subject is underneath that cluster of 9, whichever part of the subject has the most contrast is going to be what the cluster or one of the points will lock onto. One of the benefits of this focusing grouping is that you can move around the frame just with one click on the direction pad, one click up, one click down. So it does get you around the frame quite quickly when you're trying to compose in a bit of a rush or in a hurry, but it doesn't have pinpoint accuracy when you're not really controlling which focus point grabs focus. So it's a setting that I make use of only when I'm certain that I have enough depth of field from my exposure settings, and when I have enough light to allow that extra depth of field so that I'm sure that whichever part of my subject I get focus on, I still get the entire animal in focus. The next focus grouping is called large zone. So this is just a bigger group of focus points. So instead of 9, like a zone, this one is more than 9, 15 or 9 or 12 out on the edges. So even quicker motion from the right to the left with the direction pad, or you can use the front wheel to move all the way left or across just with one click. So these are fast steps around the focusing grid, but again, you don't have precise control over which focus point grabs focus in that cluster. So then we're going to move on to the fourth of these focus groupings on the 80D, which is going to be the one called 45 point AF. So this one enables all 45 points at once. It also allows, or it's set up so that the camera can choose the first focus point that finds contrast by itself, or we can influence that by one of the menu settings, so that yes, we have 45 points active, but the first point that chooses focus when we begin focusing is selected by ourselves. So I find this to be a very useful way to work, and we're going to go into the camera's menu just to show you where that setting is now. To set up the 45 point autofocus so that we have control over which single point focus starts with, we go back to our autofocus menu, custom function 2, and we go to option number 11, and you'll see the description that I've chosen there is number 2, and it says manual AF point. If you select that option, what it really means is that whichever point or position you leave your camera in once you've been shooting with a single point is exactly where the focusing will begin once you're in the multiple point option. So I'm going to switch over to all 45 points, and there you can see that because I left my focus point over on the far left while I was in single point, it now starts at that position in 45 point. The thing about 45 point autofocusing, that's where the focusing begins, is if you have it set this way, but if it can track a subject, so it will hand over from that point to any one of the other 45 while you doing your bit to keep the camera on that subject. What I have found for my own shooting, if I'm photographing birds that are flying in a clear sky, then the 45 point autofocus system works very well. I can even be almost off the subject, and one of the 45 points or two of them will hang on to it. But what I have found is if I'm shooting those same birds, and I'm just using birds as an example, but against a structured background, something that is similar to them in tone or brightness, then I find that the 45 point autofocus is not that accurate, and it quite easily will grab the foreground or background. So when I'm shooting easier subjects, those ones with a clearly different background, I'll make use of 45 point autofocus. Also when I have enough depth of field, just like AF zone, so that it doesn't matter which part of my subject 45 point autofocus grabs, then it's successful for me. When I have more difficult situations, so the background is more structured, then I'm going to, and more similar to my subject, then I'm going to switch over to single point autofocus and get a better result that way. It's pretty easy on the 80D to switch between those different focus groupings just by using the little button that's next to the shutter. So it's not like you have to pick one and stick with it for hours on end. You can just switch between them as you need them. With 4 different grouping options, which we've just gone through, there is also a way to get rid of the ones that you don't use. If you find that you don't like using some of them, or you have your favorites, so that's available in menu option number 8. So here you can see single point, AF zone, large zone, and then the 45 point auto. So if we go into this, we can deselect the ones that we don't want by pushing the set button. So you might decide that you prefer only using a single focus point, and then you would click OK. The other 3 focus groupings now are not available to you instantly, so when you push the MFN button next to the shutter, you're only going to have that single focus point grouping to work through. So that can save you time, stop you making mistakes. If you find you like single point and 45 point, then you can have a check mark on those 2, push OK, and now when you want to cycle through those different groupings, you can see only single point and 45 point are highlighted. So it's pretty easy to move between the 2 of them and not get confused on one of the others. In this video, we've taken a look at 3 of the most important parameters that deal with how servo tracking works, with tracking sensitivity being the most important one of all. We've also had a look at the 4 different focus point groupings in the camera's 45 point grid, and also sort of discussed some of the different ways that you can make those things work well for your kind of shooting. In the next video on the 80D's autofocus, we're going to be looking at focus timing and getting a better idea of how that works. Subscribe to this channel if you want to keep getting videos about Canon gear from a wildlife photographer's perspective.